what exactly does the Preservation League do? Well, there's a list on your screen of some of our most prominent programs. We collaborate with local colleagues all across the state. So I mentioned PAST, the Preservation League of New York State, um, collaborates with your local preservation associations in your town. So that's Hackney, PAST, Preservation Long Island, Preservation Buffalo, Niagara, and lots of groups in between. So we make sure that they are equipped to handle the preservation um, challenges in their communities. And we provide a voice in Albany for historic preservation. So we get involved with public policy initiatives and advocacy all the time. In fact, this Wednesday is Preservation Advocacy Day. So we'll be in Albany virtually and meeting with legislators to make sure that preservation always has a seat at the table when it comes to sustainable community development and bills and laws that get passed. We also provide technical services across New York State. So, oh, and please, attendees, make sure that you have your microphone muted. So look down to the lower left-hand corner of your box and just make sure that you're muted, and so that you can hear me, but I can't. All right, so technical services include programs just like this one. So we help individuals, nonprofits, and municipalities all across the state with their preservation challenges through programs, advice, referrals. We also have our 7 to Save program, which shines a light on endangered properties and helps bring advanced technical services to them and a greater exposure so that the public is aware of the needs of endangered buildings and how we can help save them. We also have a grants and loans program. So right now we are in the middle of our Preserve New York grant cycle. Actually, we just started that. The deadline is April 12th. We'll talk a little bit about that. If you're interested in applying for a Preserve New York grant, we have a workshop coming up on the 25th, just in a few days, about that. So, and I'll put up a slide later on that shows these important workshop dates for you to keep in mind. We also give Preservation Excellence Awards every year to individuals and projects that are particularly deserving of recognition for their historic preservation efforts. We have 2 grant programs a year, our technical assistance grants in the fall and the Preserve New York grants in the spring. That's the grant program that we are currently in the middle of. And the reason I mentioned grants is because when it comes to National Register historic districts, the Preservation League gets involved in creating these districts by providing grants that pay for cultural resource surveys. And this is a way to get started in planning a National Register historic district in your area. Now, without further ado, I'm going to introduce Katie Como from Barrel Architecture so that she can talk all about National Register districts, how they're created and what they mean to you. So welcome, Katie. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that you can share yours.
Hey, great. I'm Katie Como. I'm based in Rochester, and so some of what I'll be saying might be a little bit specific to my region, but I do work throughout New York State. So for those of you not in New York State, if there are some of this might be a little bit different in your state, but hopefully relevant for everybody anyway, with maybe some slight tweaks in some places. So let's see. There we go. I'm going to be talking about the National Register of Historic Places and about National Register Historic Districts in particular. And I'm going to go through kind of what is the National Register, some typical myths and facts that people may, some myths people may hold about the National Register and trying to clear up some of those, and then kind of the basics of the process, how it works to get a neighborhood listed in the National Register as a district. So just to start with the very basic information, what is the National Register of Historic Places? It's essentially an honorary program that's administered as a partnership between the National Park Service at the federal level and the State Historic Preservation Office at the state level. And it recognizes a very wide variety of properties and places that are important in national, state, and local history. came about as part of the National Preservation Framework that was established in the 1960s in response to the loss of some key historic buildings. This is Penn Station, which is one of the most kind of painful losses for the preservation communities, but one that did catalyze a lot of change in this area. Of course, the 60s, 50s, and 60s were the time of urban renewal and highway construction and things, and people were watching as this kind of change was going on without a lot of regard for what had gone before. You know, a lot of interest in modernization and creating the city of the future, not so much interest in preserving the past. So the National Register was one of the aspects of the preservation framework that came about at that time. If you remember one thing from this presentation, maybe it would be this one, which is that the National Register is essentially really an honorary program that has benefits to people who live in buildings or properties listed in the National Register, including districts, but without really the kind of restrictions that people sometimes associate with historic designation. So we'll go into that in some more detail, but just to know that it's all carrot, no stick. There's some benefits, but really the restrictions on private owners that people might expect are just not there. So I know depending on how you have your screen set up, you may not be able to see all of this. You can slide those little boxes around if you want to, but it's not essential to read all of this, and I'm not going to read all of it. But just to give you a sense of what types of properties get listed in the National Register and what the criteria are, the first one is not really so much a criterion, but a general guideline, which isn't on here, which is it's typically for properties 50 years old or older. That is not a hard and fast rule, and properties can be listed in the National Register younger than that, but generally speaking, we're talking about things that are 50 or more years old. And that have, the first paragraph here has to do with integrity, meaning that physically the property has to be recognizable to its historic condition. It doesn't have to be perfect, and change over time is part of the history of the property and can be recognized, but something that has been completely altered or demolished is not going to be normally listed in the National Register. And then you need to meet one of the next four criteria, the one with the letters. Not all of them. Often properties meet more than one, but it's not necessary. The first one having to do with events. That could be a one-time thing like a battle or a significant civil rights protest, or something that happened one time, or it can be something that happened over a long period of time. So it could be an event such as the development of an industry that was important to a community, or the development of residential neighborhoods that tell a story of a community's growth. So that is a very broad one, and that's probably the one that I end up dealing with the most. Criterion B has to do with the lives of significant people. It doesn't have to be George Washington. It could be a local merchant or somebody significant at the local level. Criterion C, actually this might even be the one I deal with more than Criterion A, because this has to do with architectural or other design significance. So perhaps an excellent example of an architectural style or a landscape architecture style, or the work of a master architect, landscape architect, sculptor, something like that. Criterion D is the one I never deal with, and this has to do with archaeology. But archaeological sites can be listed in the National Register. It's just something an archaeologist would deal with, and not me. So people mostly think of the National Register and of landmarks as a category more generally as having to do with buildings. And buildings are, of course, one category of something that can be listed in the National Register, but it's not the only one. So a building, that's pretty obvious what that is. A structure is something that is built for a purpose other than sort of living in and occupying, and that could be something like a bridge or a dam. An object is, this one is a hitching post, but typically that would be a sculpture, something like that. A site is basically a landscape, so often a cemetery or a park. And then archaeological sites would come under that as well. And then a district is what we're talking about today, and that is a collection of any of the above, really. Districts can range in scale from a few buildings to thousands of buildings, and can be anything. Here's a few different types of examples. So a farmstead type of property where you have a collection of buildings that together tell that story of the history of this place. It could be an urban neighborhood of, it could be a small neighborhood around an intersection or a huge neighborhood of thousands of properties, or something like a village. So any kind of scale. It's just something where you have multiple properties. They don't all have to be buildings. They can be any of the property types that I mentioned above. So now the myths and facts. And if people have other myths that they want to bring up in the chat or in the questions at the end, that would be fine. But these are some of the ones that I've heard the most over the course of working in this field, both in my current position as a consultant, and then previously I used to work at the Landmark Society of Western New York, and so these are the types of questions that we would get all the time when I was there. So the first one would be that National Register listing is a way to protect a property forever. It's never going to be demolished. And the fact of the matter is that the National Register, being mostly an honorary program, doesn't actually protect properties from being demolished by their private owners. Private owners are free to do anything they want to their National Register listed property, whether it's individually listed or in a district, as long as they're complying with any other zoning or other land use regulations that might exist at the local level. The National Register is not going to prevent you from demolishing your building or doing anything else that you like with it. What it does prevent is the government from demolishing your building, and that's because of the origins of this program really were about urban renewal and highway construction and things like that, where the government was kind of willy-nilly demolishing things without any review or accountability. So what the program is really designed to do is prevent that from happening. So if something is listed in the National Register, or in some cases eligible for the National Register, and the government wants to tear it down to build a highway or whatever else the government might want to do, there is a review process that may not necessarily ultimately prevent demolition, but at least requires review and consideration of whether the project could be accomplished in a way that didn't require that demolition. So in that way, there's that limited amount of protection, but as long as someone is doing a demolition with their own money, they can do whatever they want. And the second one, obviously very closely related to that, is this idea people have that I won't be able to paint my house the color I want, I won't be able to put on an addition, I won't be able to change my windows or my siding. And the fact here is exactly the same as before. There is no restriction on what a private owner does with their own money. They can paint their building whatever color they want, whether anybody else likes it or not. They can make any changes that are consistent with zoning and with any other local regulations, but the National Register is not going to prevent people from doing what they want with their own property. The next one is a myth that I wish was true, but is not. And this was a question I did used to get a lot when I worked at the Landmark Society of Western New York, which is, how do I get into that big pot of money that's out there for people who own historic buildings? And sometimes people thought it was there if they wanted to fix their house. Sometimes people thought just for owning the house they should get government money. And unfortunately, that's not the case. There is a kernel of truth in this one, however, because there are some funds available for owners of buildings in National Register districts. These are the carrots. So not as much funding as we would wish, but there are tax credits available. This is not just for owning the building, but for doing a substantial amount of rehabilitation work. The best credits that are out there are if you own a building that is a commercial building that produces income, so something like a hotel or an apartment building that's rental apartments, or an office building. If you're making money from the property and you do a substantial amount of rehabilitation work, there are tax credits available at the state and federal level to help defray that cost. There's also a newer program, although at this point it's been around for a while, at the state level for owners of historic houses in certain historic districts, certain National Register listed districts. It's not available everywhere, but in certain districts that qualify under the way the state qualifies certain census tracts, so it's tied to the income not of the owner but of the income level of the tract as a whole. So there are some tax credits available for private owners of owner-occupied houses who want to do rehabilitation work on their properties. And in that case, you do have to follow certain pretty broad preservation requirements. You can't take the government's money and then do absolutely anything. But if you're doing, legitimate rehabilitation work, there are tax credits available. And I know the Preservation League does workshops on that, so I'm not going to go into a tremendous amount of detail, but there is more information available on through the Preservation League or the State Historic Preservation Office about that. So the next one is that the National Register is for only nationally significant properties, so the homes of former presidents, the most elite and special districts, places like Charleston and places like that are kind of significant at a national level or absolutely perfect in every way. In reality, that one also does sort of have a kernel of truth behind it relating to the history of the National Register, which is when it was first started in the 60s. The first things that were designated tended to be those most significant properties that everybody wanted to see recognized in that way. So it did start out, focusing on homes of former presidents and other wealthy white men and the most, fancy residential districts and things like that. But that was never meant to be the entire extent of the program. And over time, more and more things that don't fall into that category of Washington slept here or whatever are being nominated. Not as many as there should be. There's still a lot of work to be done in this account, but it's certainly getting to be much more recognition of a broader telling of the American story that does include more resources associated with minorities and with themes like civil rights and things like that. There's definitely a lot of attention to that now. A lot still needs to be done, but this, for example, is Mount Vernon on the left, and then on the right is a Rosenwald School, which is a school built for educating African American students in the South in the 20th century. So, things don't have to be the grand palatial mansions to be listed in the National Register by any means. They'd have to have some connection to something of significance, but certainly that significance can have to do with a immigrant group or a local industry or other things that are not necessarily the glamorous fancy houses. The final myth is not the final myth there is everywhere, but the last one I'm going to talk about is having to do with property values. People fear that being in a National Register district is going to reduce the value of their property. And there have been studies about this that have shown that the effect is kind of neutral to positive for the National Register. This one also has to do with kind of a source of confusion that a lot of people have between two different types of ways of recognizing historic properties, one of which is the National Register, which is what we're talking about today, and the other which is a completely separate program of local historic districts, or sometimes called local preservation districts. In the city of Rochester, they use the term preservation district, I think, as a way to distinguish the two. So there have been a lot of studies about the economic impact of local historic districts, not as much about National Register districts, but I think that's where some of the confusion comes in, and this is definitely where the confusion comes in around some of the other myths, because it's completely understandable people would be mixed up by these two similar but completely separately administered programs. So just to go through kind of the differences between the two very quickly, the National Register, which we're talking about today, is a program of the federal government and state government working in partnership, available everywhere in the country, no restrictions on what private owners do with their buildings. There is limited protection from government actions, so the highway scenario that we talked about, and it does provide some incentives to in terms of tax credits and grants for tax credits for private owners, some limited amount of grants available to nonprofit owners of properties in National Register districts. So the local district, that is a completely different program that is locally administered, and that's on purpose because the whole idea behind kind of the preservation framework is to put the teeth at the local level where citizens have the most direct ability to have their say about what kind of restrictions or regulations they would like locally. The federal government isn't going to impose those, but the local government, where people have the most say, is where those may come into place. But they only exist in certain communities where the local government, whether it's town, village, or state, has enacted a preservation ordinance. So that is something done at that local level by local government officials, and as part of the local, local regulations, zoning code for that community. So here in the Rochester area, the city of Rochester has a preservation ordinance. The best known one probably locally is the village of Pittsford. I believe the village of Fairport has a new one. There are other towns and villages, but it's a minority, I think, at least in this part of the state. Most places don't have this, but some do. So the next one, the restrictions on alterations, this is where the confusion is happening in people's mind about I won't be able to do anything with my house, because if you are in a local preservation district, there is a local preservation board that will review exterior changes, not interior changes, almost never paint color, but exterior changes to materials or design. You know, you're putting on a new porch or a new addition, that would be reviewed by the local preservation board, but is not reviewed by the National Register. So this does give you some protection from your neighbors doing something that might affect your property values. So this is where the property value confusion comes in, is that this actually can have a positive impact on property values in terms of keeping them, you know, helping them stay higher. Whether you think that's a good thing or a bad thing depends on your perspective on that, but this is where that impact is seen more noticeably, because you do have that protection. You can be confident that your neighbor is not going to tear down their house and put up a chain drugstore, because they would have to go to the preservation board in addition to whatever zoning there might be. But you know, your neighbor can't put up an inappropriate fence right up to your house, which my neighbors did in the National Register district, but would not have been allowed to do in a preservation district. Your neighbor is not going to be able to put on some, you know, garish, you know, or a two-story addition on top of their house that's going to look down on your house, or you know, a lot of these things would fall under the purview of a local preservation board, but it's completely separate from the National Register. The downside, I suppose, is that there are not typically a lot of incentives that go along with local district designation, at least not in this area. There might be other communities where that is more common, but it is not something that we have here in the Rochester area. Okay, so just to go through quickly how National Register districts actually come about. Usually they are initiated by people who live in a neighborhood, have heard about tax credits or other reasons that they might want to be a National Register district, often just a source of pride to recognize your neighborhood's history. And so residents would start this process. It's not typically initiated by the government, or sometimes it might be kind of done in partnership with the local preservation organization, but it is usually residents who start this process. And it is important that it be kind of generated by owners, because part of the process does involve reaching out to the owners to make sure that there's some base of support for this. Technically, under the law, if there's the state is at the sort of the end of the process going to send out a letter to everyone in the district and give them the opportunity to object, and if more than 50% of owners object, then the nomination can't go forward. In reality, at least in New York State, if you get a loud minority of people objecting, that nomination also is very unlikely to go ahead, because it's just not worth it to anyone to try to force something like this through over the objections of owners who are, you know, just basically passing up the opportunity to take on those benefits. So it's important to kind of build that base of support early on in the process, head off any of those myths that people might have about I won't be able to do anything with my property or whatever else people might be concerned about. And it's great if residents can take the lead in that process and in educating their own neighbors with the support of someone like your local preservation organization or the Preservation League of New York State, which can really be helpful in identifying resources for how to do that. So a good thing to do early on is, if you're interested in this, to reach out to the Preservation League or to your local preservation organization for that kind of help. Often a district nomination will start with a historic resource survey, which is just essentially an inventory of all the buildings and other properties within the potential district. So sometimes a number of communities have done this already at sort of the town-wide or village-wide or city-wide resource survey. and have already identified some potential historic districts. And so that's a great place to start, with the caution that if these were done 20, 25, 30 or more years ago, they are out of date because of changes that have happened between then and now, but also because as time has gone on and we've broadened our expectation for what types of resources might qualify for a district, in other words, that it isn't anymore just the big fancy mansions, but can include working class communities and other types of neighborhoods. An older survey may have not included any of that because that's not what they were thinking about at the time. So I have had it happen quite a number of times that someone's come to me with an old historic resource survey and said, this is my neighborhood, it has 40 houses in it, and I would like to start the National Register district process. But in looking at that neighborhood again, we realized that, okay, 35 years ago, that's what we thought the district was. But today, because we're trying to be much more inclusive and expansive and have a broader view of what might be significant, that district might not be 40 properties, it might be 200. And that is not always particularly welcome news to a neighbor who just kind of wants to get their tax credits as quickly as possible. But in terms of making sure that we're truly recognizing the history of a place, it's much better to be as broad and inclusive as you can. So historic resource is a good place to start, with the caveat that older ones might be out of date. With that survey or with whatever other process you might use, it might be just kind of a much more informal process of photographs and touring. The goal is to identify a district that can be officially determined eligible by the State Historic Preservation Office. And this is the system that our state, New York, uses, which is an online system called the Cultural Resource Information System. And so once there is an official eligibility determination, there will be kind of a boundary drawn. And in this case, this was based on a previous survey, so all those little green dots represent buildings that were included in that previous survey. So that's kind of what you want first, is to get some agreement that there's an eligible district here and what the boundaries are. Whoa. And then the next step is to actually put together the nomination. And there are two main kind of narrative portions to the nomination, in addition to some just general, paperwork to fill out. But the two main narrative portions, the first one is what I always call it section 7, because it's section 7 of the form. And this is the description of the district. This is based on spending a lot of time out in the district taking photographs, so that you can include a description of the district as a whole. So any streetscape features, what kind of, is it a grid plan? Is it winding roads? Are there curbs? Are there street trees? Are there sidewalks? What's the kind of topography, the general characteristics? And then what you're seeing here is the descriptions of each individual building within the district. And that is not, it doesn't have to be a lengthy narrative about each one, but enough so that it's clear what the key features of that building or other types of property were. And within that, there can be, within a district, not every building has to be pristine or even part of the history of the district. There can be buildings that were newer or that have been altered. Those might be called non-contributing. So there's something that's built later than what the identified period of significance, which is the time period over which the district became important, or that have been changed so much that they're just basically unrecognizable. So it's okay to have a district that has some non-contributing properties. So this section 7 based on the field work and spending time out in the field. The other section is called section 8. That's where you have the explanation of the history and significance, how the district meets National Register criteria, whether it meets Criterion A, B, C, D, multiple criteria. And so this is based on a significant amount of research and analysis. So for example, looking at historic maps, looking at census records, city directories if they exist, newspaper archives, books, talking to the local historian and getting any kind of archives and information that might have been collected. So this is, for me, this is the fun part. I really like writing section 8 and delving into the history and trying to make that argument. The sponsor of the district, which is typically, again, it might be an individual person living in the district, or more commonly it's maybe a group of people or a neighborhood association, something like that. can play, has to play some role and can play a very significant role in this whole process, depending on how it's all kind of structured. The because of the what I described before in terms of the process by which the state sends out letters to everyone in the potential district, it's important that the sponsor be part of that education and publicity process. So right from the start, maybe meeting with the neighborhood association to explain what this process is and why you think it's valuable. And then depending on how your neighborhood works, if there's a neighborhood Facebook page or some sort of neighborhood newsletter, getting information in there, holding meetings. There's a required public meeting at the end of the process, but it's good to not wait until the end because um, if you wait till the end to get this information out, then the people who hold those various myths are going to start up their own Facebook pages and Twitter threads and TikTok, whatever it is people do to get this kind of information out there, or misinformation in this case. They're going to get people riled up and spread those myths. So you want to get ahead of that by holding fact-based public meetings that spread the real information about what the National Register is and how it's going to be helpful for your neighborhood, and just try to head all that off. So that's all very important, and the State Historic Preservation Office is going to work with the project sponsor to make sure that all that happens as early as possible and continues throughout the process. Something else that a sponsor can do is take on a bit more of a hands-on role in a nomination. And I sometimes, when I've worked on nominations, sometimes have done it this way and sometimes not. It just depends. But something that can be very helpful in a couple of different ways is if the sponsor would like to help with photography, either themselves or maybe they want to gather some volunteers, some friends. The official photos that go in with the National Register, I take those myself, but if I'm working with volunteers who would like to go around and photograph every building in the district, that can be super helpful for me as I'm writing the descriptions. And in addition to being a time saver for me, it's also a really great way to get neighbors out there talking to people directly because, I can guarantee your neighbors are going to want to know what someone's doing out, taking pictures of your property. Taking pictures of their property, and so it's a great opportunity to talk to people, to explain. I always, when I'm doing the photography myself, I always carry around a handout that explains what the National Register is and why this is happening, and certainly volunteers can do the same and can be out there taking photographs and explaining what's happening. It's a great way to get visibility for the project. And sometimes, it used to be that these were all done with filling out paper forms on every building. We don't do it that way anymore. Sometimes I do have an iPad-based form that people can fill out. So if there are volunteers who really would like to do that kind of thing, to stand in front of the building and take notes, that can also be a good publicity, way to get some publicity as well. In a district setting, depending on the district and how large it is and kind of the nature of it, you usually don't need to do a ton of very detailed research on every single property in like a typical residential historic district. You don't have to know the name of every owner or anything like that. But if you have volunteers who want to do that and want to get involved in the research process, they certainly can. So that's another way for people to get involved. And then at the end of the process, this is something I do always have the sponsor do. When the state is going to send out those official notification letters, they have to have the full list of every property in the district, the owner, name, and legal mailing address, which may or may not be the same as the property. And so I always ask the sponsor to do that, to work with their village clerk or whoever keeps those records at the municipal level to put that list together. And then if sponsors want to, or they can do all kinds of fun stuff. They can go to neighborhood festivals and talk about the project. This photograph is from one here in Rochester, where as part of their fundraising, they did a T-shirt that works both as fundraising from selling T-shirts and also getting shirts on people as a way to publicize the project. So there's lots of fun things that people can do if they want to. And I have certainly found that getting neighbors and sponsors involved is a really great way to build support for a project like this. So that is the end of what I have, and we can do some Q&A. Do you want me to unshare my screen or leave it like this, do you think, Jenna?
You can leave it like this for the time being, and then when I kick back in with my final remarks, I'll go ahead and share my screen at that time. We do have a number of questions. Katie, are you able to see the chat?
Let me see.
If not, I can field them for you. So just let me know. Joel had 3 questions. You might have answered some of his questions during your presentation after he asked them. So um, let me scroll up and,
Okay.
okay, are you able to see those? I can.
I am, but if you want to kind of direct me to any particular ones.
Sure, absolutely, because there's quite a bit going on in the chat. So 2 things that I wanted to mention first. If you're here for continuing education credits, please read the chat. There's an important message for you there. At the end, there will be a question for you all to answer. That's for those seeking continuing ed credits for planners and architects. Now, Joel had 3 questions pertaining to the first one was that his local historic preservation commission held a meeting, and they told the community that listing on the National Register provided no protection and was only honorary. So I believe that you clarified a little bit of that in your presentation, but if you care to chime in.
Yeah, so that what they're probably referring to is the fact that it's no protection in terms of it doesn't prevent private owners from doing what they want with their property. The only protection really is from government actions. So it's the highway widening scenario, the urban renewal scenario. It's meant to prevent the government from tearing down buildings in your neighborhood without there being a review process.
Exactly. And he followed that up with a question about seeker and the reviews there, and was asking, uh, isn't there a protection through seeker for private actions requiring a government permit?
Yes, yes. And I didn't get into that because that gets a little bit complicated, but that is true that if you are either, if you as a private owner are either receiving government funding or need to get a discretionary permit from the government, then yes, there is some limited protection. When you're on the side of things of trying to preserve something, it always feels like that is not enough because it just always seems like um, the developers or whoever are able to get through that process with only kind of maybe lip service to preservation or recognizing, oh yes, it's unfortunate that this building needs to get torn down, but we have no choice. But yes, there is that limited amount of protection through local law. But again, it's only it's kind of limited situation. It doesn't apply to a typical homeowner.
Mhm. Okay, and then finally, he also asked about the procedure that he'd need to go through in order to update a National Register nomination that didn't initially distinguish between contributing and non-contributing properties. And you talked about that just after he asked that
Yeah.
question.
Yep. Well, I think that's good to talk about updating National Register nominations more generally. That's a good question, and that is something I do spend quite a bit of time doing because um, I mentioned that surveys in the past weren't always as thorough as we would expect them to be today, and that was certainly the case as well for National Register nominations. That if you look at one that was done in the early 70s or even the 80s, they might say all properties on Main Street from number 1 to number 200, and that's it. And they might call out the ones that were considered intrusions or non-contributing, but they might not. And they definitely don't include the type of resource list that we're required to do today. So if if you're if you have a community that has an older nomination, it can be a good idea to go through the process of updating that. It could be that boundaries should change. That happens quite often. That resources that we would now include weren't included at the time, and it certainly is usually the case that there's not enough history. That it might have a couple paragraphs, whereas today you're expected to write like a master's thesis about the significance of this place practically, um, and and then having this more thorough building list. So a lot of things. There are a bunch of reasons to update a National Register nomination, and if you wanted to do, let's say, a boundary increase, um, most likely with an old enough nomination, you'd be also rewriting the whole thing. So that can be a mixed blessing. It's a good thing to do, but it can mean that you can't just simply say like, oh, we now want to add these 5 properties and provide the same level of documentation we did for the other 50. Nope, you're going to have to probably go back and bring the whole thing up to current standards.
Okay. And Amy had a question. She's wondering what's required to show that a community has 50% owner support.
So
Would
the
that
process, yeah, the process is actually you don't have to show 50% support. What you have to do is when the state sends out their notification letter, which happens at some, I forget the exact number, it's a few weeks before the end of the whole process. If, as long as fewer than 50% actually object, then you're, you're okay. But you don't want to wait till that point and suddenly find out that there's 50% objections. So it would be a good idea to, you know, like I said, to hold public meetings, to make sure that you've gotten information out to everybody, and that you as the, if you're the resident, that you have at least some kind of informal sense. You know, you don't, there's no specific requirement that you conduct a poll or that you gather letters of support, although it wouldn't be a bad idea to do that. But you just don't want to be taken by surprise if at the end of the process there's vocal objection. So the best thing really is to just get the information out there, make sure you kind of have a sense of whether there is that level of support. But there isn't, you know, a requirement that you do other than anything specific, I should say. You know, the state will work with you, and if they're getting the sense that they're hearing a lot of complaints and grumblings and questions, then they might say, all right, we're going to have a couple, you know, we encourage you to hold a couple extra public meetings or whatever. So that's how that tends to work. And it just depends on the situation. If you're anticipating objections, you know, you'd really want to get out there and head that off.
wonderful? Thank you. So if anyone has any other questions, please type them into the chat. I'd like to talk a little bit about how the Preservation League of New York State supports National Register districts. And we do that most directly through our grants program. So go back to my screen here. I mentioned before that we have two grant cycles a year. Now the Preserve New York grant cycle that we're in currently contains funding for cultural resource surveys. And what that means is that we help fund the process of getting a National Register district identified and listed. So if you're interested in applying, the Preserve New York grants are open to nonprofits and municipalities. And you have up until April 12th of this year to apply. These grants are, they do require a 20% match. The maximum grant award is $10,000 thereabouts. And it's cultural resource surveys are one of 4 categories that we fund through Preserve New York. And since we have a grant information session coming up later in the week, I won't go into great detail about the other categories, but it's the cultural resource surveys that do tend to lead to National Register district listings. Now in 2020, we gave out Preserve New York awards all across the state, including 11, I believe it was 11, yeah, cultural resource surveys. So we tend to fund quite a few of these. And I have some examples of some successful ones. One from the city of Binghamton in Broome County that just got a Preserve New York grant in 2020 to list their Front Street and Main Street Historic District. And this is an area that is challenged by neglect and lack of maintenance. It's one of the city's most distressed neighborhoods. And the $8,000 grant that they got through the Preservation League will allow them to hire environmental design and research to complete their nomination for the historic district. And what this will do is it'll open up the potential use of New York state and federal historic tax credits to property owners in that district. So there are lots of reasons to conduct a cultural resource survey to get a National Register district listed. You know, Katie mentioned historic tax credits, a level of protection against demolition, and but there's also research reasons as well. So some of the Preserve New York grants we've given for cultural resource surveys were for preserving history. So the Guilford Historical Society in Shenango County received a $6,000 Preserve New York grant to support the nomination of 95 properties in their hamlet to the state and national registers. So The goal here was to foster community pride and protect their historic resources from potential energy extraction projects. Now, this grant was made in, I believe, 2012, and that's back when fracking was becoming a concern across the state. So rural areas were looking at their historic resources and saying, what might the impact be, and how can we protect what we have? And so sometimes they need to identify what they have before they can protect it. So the Cultural Resource Survey that we funded in Shenango County helped to do that. Now the town of Hartwick had similar concerns in 2012 as well. They wanted to identify what was special about their rural areas. The town of Hartwick is pretty big, and it contains some really special little hamlets. So they wanted to identify their historic resources in order to protect them from insensitive development and possibly drilling and mining. So it's just another reason to conduct a cultural resource survey. Not necessarily to get things listed on the National Register, although you can certainly do that as well. Now, just this past year, the Greece Historical Society received a $15,000 Preserve New York grant to preserve, document and preserve history in their town. So they were aware of some buildings in their town that were designed by a prominent, actually their first and foremost African-American architect, Thomas Boyd. He was a master of mid-century modern design, and his buildings had a big impact on their communities of color. So they wanted to make sure that his buildings, which are rapidly disappearing due to demolition and neglect, they wanted to make sure those buildings that remain are documented and hopefully preserved. So that's the goal of their cultural resource survey, to identify his buildings, call attention to them, and prevent any further loss. And finally, I have one more example. It's kind of a big example out in Jamestown and Chautauqua County. Now, they did a three-phase community revitalization project to identify and list their neighborhoods on the National Register of Historic Places. Now, their goals were to encourage home ownership and investment in their city and to expand the availability of historic tax credits to property owners, hopefully to encourage people to take care of their properties, to preserve them, and to prevent neglect and disrepair. So in 2015, the Jamestown Renaissance Corporation came to the Preservation League for a $9,000 Preserve New York grant, and that was for a district nomination of their Lakeview Heights neighborhood. This is a fairly well-off neighborhood full of gorgeous, big, gorgeous houses. It built on an earlier survey that Barrow Architects had done. This was to expand the boundaries. So again, as Katie mentioned, earlier surveys often focused on the finest and the most prominent houses, but as we all know, even some more vernacular architecture deserves to be protected and preserved. So these boundaries were expanded. In 2018, they began to look at another neighborhood in the city, the Forest Heights neighborhood. It's a diverse neighborhood full of all kinds of historic buildings. So they undertook an intensive level survey in 2018 with the help of a Preserve New York grant. And then in 2019, they expanded on what had ended up being a pretty daunting project. It's a huge neighborhood, lots of different houses. So they need a little more funding to complete that project, which they did in 2019 with a smaller Preserve New York grant. And so this is making historic tax credits available to hundreds of property owners in Jamestown, and will make a big difference in their city. And we're really excited to see how that plays out over the coming years. So that's about all we had to say about National Register districts. If you have any additional questions, please type them into the chat at the bottom of your screen. And I want you to be aware too, I think that I just finished sharing my screen. I'm going to go back to my screen. I want you to be aware of some upcoming dates that you might be interested in. The Preservation League has some, let's see, oh, there we go. Now, we've got some workshops coming up in the coming days, as I mentioned, on February 25th. Erin Tobin will be presenting information about Preserve New York grants. So if you're interested in applying for one of those and need more information, you can certainly attend. On March 10th, I'll be back with you to talk about historic homeowner tax credits. The focus will be the southern tier of New York State, where I live and work around Binghamton, but this will apply to the entire state. So feel free to attend on March 10th. And then finally on March 22nd, I'll be back with a technical talk to talk about historic windows, repair, maintenance, and rehabilitation. So you can register on our website. And stay tuned also for application workshops throughout the month of March and then in early April, leading up to April 12th, Preserve New York deadline. All right, so let's see. I think we have a little information in the chat. All right, not so much. There we go. Okay, Lakeview Ave, not Heights. Okay, sorry about that. Thank you. That was the Lakeview Ave Historic District in Jamestown that I was talking about. Let's see, any other questions? Looks like Cheryl might have a question. Cheryl says they have a very large building on the National Register that's been converted to a museum. If the museum were to go under and the property was purchased by the developer next door, would the National Trust do anything because of the motion? No, because the building would be under private ownership, unfortunately, there wouldn't be unless you're using state or federal funds or require a federal, let's see, we talked about this earlier. Katie, help me.
Yeah, so there could be under the secret process, there could be something that would be done that the National Register listing might trigger, but it's unlikely. I think the best, probably depending on where you are, I would definitely reach out to your local preservation organization and or the Preservation League for help on that specific situation, because even if National Register listing doesn't provide the level of protection that you want, there could be some other help that preservation organization can give you in terms of trying to come up with some solutions for that.
Absolutely, and that is part of the work that we do at the Preservation League. We're often called upon to do some advocacy work at the local level and to help local advocates save local buildings. So there would likely be public hearings about the kind of development that would lead to the demolition of that building, and the public could come out strongly in opposition to that kind of plan, and we're always available to help you put together a plan to advocate strongly for that building in your local area. So yeah, that's something that we're unfortunately pretty familiar with, is buildings coming under threat through insensitive development. Now I'm putting a message in the chat right now for those of you seeking credits. So if you're here for continuing ed credits, please read the message and then type yes, so that I can make sure that you get the credits that you have earned today. So any additional questions besides that before we wrap it up? I just want to thank Katie Como so much for being here and for her really useful presentation. I think that you answered a lot of questions, Katie, that people have about National Register districts. Beth Crawford chimed in about clarifying the National Trust's role in preservation. They're primarily an advocacy organization at the national level.